Singularity. You're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can help me make it better by simply writing a review on iTunes or by going to conversationswiththefuture.com and simply making a donation. Today, my guest on the show is Adam Becker. Adam is a PhD in astrophysics, a fellow at the Santa Fe Institute, and a science journalist. His most recent book is called More Everything Forever: AI Overlords, Space Empires, and Silicon Valley's Crusade to Control the Fate of Humanity. So, Adam, welcome to Singularity FM.
Oh, thanks for having me, Nicola. It's good to be here.
Fantastic. So, let me share the story of how I discovered your book. Actually, I'm a big fan of Seth Godin's, and he had your book among the list of books that he recommends just a couple of weeks ago. And that's then I discovered that Cory Doctorow also has endorsed your book. Melanie Mitchell is another one, and all those three, by the way, are previous guests on my podcast.
Oh,
And
great.
so I couldn't help it but get curious and look into your book. And lo and behold, now I think that your book is perhaps the best book of its kind.
Well,
And when I
thank you.
say it's kind, I mean the kind that is constructively critical of the transhumanist and singularitarian AI, uh, effective altruism, or any other of those largely overlapping rationalist and so on, largely overlapping communities. And I believe that whether people agree with you or disagree with you, they would be so much better off if they actually uh, give you the benefit of the doubt and check out your book. So that's how and why I got you here today.
Well, thanks for having me, and that's very kind of you. And yes, Seth actually reached out to me to say how much he liked my book, and of course, Corey and Melanie were both, very kind in reading an early, proofs of the book to write blurbs for it, and I'm big fans of all three of them.
Yeah, and those are high praises as far as I'm concerned. But let's roll back the tape of time a little bit and
Yeah,
see first who is Adam Becker. So
sure.
imagine we're just meeting somewhere in a conference or in a bar sitting next to each other, and I just ask you, who is Adam Becker? How would you introduce yourself in a sentence?
Well, in a sentence, I'd say that I'm a science journalist and author with a PhD in astrophysics. So, and that I am interested in a wide range of things, everything from the things that you might expect from that description, like physics and astronomy, to ideas about the future, ideas about narrative structure, and trees, stars. I'm curious about everything.
Wonderful. So curiosity is a guiding light to anyone who is interested in science in general, and perhaps
Yeah.
physics more than anything else in particular. So tell me, how did you end up, first of all, doing a PhD in physics, and what kind of area of physics did you specialize? What was your thesis about?
Sure. I mean, how I ended up doing the PhD in physics, I think, is sort of the usual story for that. I was just interested in science from a very young age, interested in space specifically from a very young age, which I talk about a little bit in the new book. Uh, and that interest was just always with me and is still with me. And it led me to an interest in physics, and I was always interested in math, and then when I was a kid, I watched Cosmos with Carl Sagan and thought, oh yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to be that guy. And so then I ended up going off and studying physics. And then as for what my thesis was on, I so specifically my PhD is in cosmology, and what I was looking at like all cosmologists looking at the universe on the very largest scales, trying to understand the history of its evolution. And what I was looking at was a specific area of cosmology called primordial non-Gaussianity, which is a fancy way of saying that I was trying to figure out various statistical properties of the very, very early universe, like right after or possibly even right before the Big Bang, by looking at the universe right now, looking at the large scale structure of the universe, like where galaxies are and galaxy clusters, and also looking at the oldest light in the universe, the cosmic microwave background radiation, which is like a baby picture of the universe or a fingerprint.
Maybe that's the wrong way to look at it, but when someone tells me they're interested in cosmology, it's like me hearing Douglas Adams in the back of my mind and hearing them say, "I want to know about life, the universe, and
Yeah.
everything."
I don't think that's wrong. I mean, that's what attracted me, and I think a lot of people to cosmology in particular. Is like, oh, you want to ask the biggest questions? Well, in physics, the way you ask the biggest questions stereotypically is like either you go real big or real small. And I wanted to go big.
Wow, that's fascinating. I've had a number of cosmologists and astrophysicists back in my podcast, from Sir Martin Rees to Lawrence Krauss to Michio Kaku and a few others. Um, Let me ask you though, because it's kind of a strange jump. So you go to astrophysics, you
Mm-hmm.
finish a PhD in cosmology, and then you end up being a journalist.
Yes.
Isn't that kind of a shift, a big sort of refocus? And why? Why and
Well,
how did that happen?
yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, there's a couple of different reasons why I did that. One of them goes back to what I was saying before about, being a kid and watching Carl Sagan and pointing to him and being like, I want to be that guy. And, when I said that, when, I first formulated that ambition at the ripe old age of what, 8, uh, I wasn't really thinking about, the difference between, say, being the guy doing the research and being the guy explaining the subject to the public. In part because it hadn't occurred to me that those two things were different because I was a
Hmm.
kid, and in
Hmm.
part because Carl Sagan was doing both.
Yeah.
And I, as I got older and as I got farther and farther along in my physics education and physics research, I realized, I like this. I'm reasonably good at this, but I'm better at explaining this stuff than I am at doing the research. Like I'm fine at research and I enjoyed research, but I enjoyed explaining the subject and talking about it with people and hearing about other scientists' research even more than I enjoyed doing my own. And perhaps in a different world or a different point in time where the academic job market was sort of easier, I would have said, "Oh, okay, well, I'll stay in academia and just do a lot of science outreach." But as I think you and most of your listeners know, the academic job market has been pretty rough for a long time. I mean, it's even rougher right now, but even when I was finishing up my PhD, 13 years ago, the job market was not easy. Um, and I looked at that and said, okay, I'm not even sure that this is what I want. I'm not sure that being a professor at a research university, which is sort of like the obvious goal if you're a grad school for physics, I'm not sure that that's what I want. Most people who get PhDs in physics at this point don't end up doing that. And I thought, well, I'm okay at research. I'm more than okay. I'm pretty good. I'm not a rock star, but I'm pretty good. Uh, and I'm a pretty good writer and speaker, but I'm a lot better at writing and speaking than most physicists. and I'm a lot better at physics than most writers and speakers. So if I can find a way to combine those two, I think that would not only be more fun, but I would probably do better. Uh, and so, that makes it sound like it was this very sort of short, deliberative process. And of course, it was longer than that, involved a lot of thinking and talking with people and talking to friends who were science journalists. But by the end of graduate school, I was pretty sure that if I could make science journalism work, which is a pretty big if, that was the direction that I wanted to go in, that seemed like a better fit for my interests and talents.
Yeah, and I have to say, you made a good choice, a big choice, but also a good choice because your book is. I mean, I've now done over 300 of these interviews, and I've read, at least 300 books. Usually, I read a book before I do an interview with the person.
Sure.
And most scientists have issues communicating
Yeah.
very well, or keeping the engagement of the reader for a long book duration kind of thing.
Yep.
You don't have that problem at all. In fact, your
Thank you.
writing is very engaging and pretty rewarding and kind of fun. So I
Thank you.
think you made a good choice. You're an excellent writer, in my opinion, and I enjoyed, especially after the first third of the book. I started getting more and more on your kind of site, and the halfway through and towards the end, more and more, and totally, pretty much. Uh, so
Thank you.
uh, so by the end, maybe I should share with my audience that my bias was that I would agree probably 75% with you by the end of the book. Now, okay, so we have a kid that loves science and math, that's influenced by Carl Sagan, that does a PhD in cosmology. That's a kind of an interesting story, but it's not very unique in my community of people and among my audience, by the way, many of whom are highly accomplished, both in terms of educational degrees, but also technological sophistication and so on.
Yeah.
So then the next jump from science journalism is into writing books, because
Yes.
journalists not always write books,
That's right.
and especially they don't write books which are titled "More Everything Forever" and take on, the whole of Silicon Valley, if you will, and some
Sure.
of the richest and most powerful people in the world.
Yeah.
So how do we make that jump from cosmology and physics? We are now into journalism, and now suddenly we're taking on the biggest, most powerful people around the world. How is that happening? Give me the genesis story, if there is one, behind the inception and eventually commitment to such an ambitious idea, if not
Sure.
foolhardy.
Yeah. Foolhardy is maybe not the wrong word for it, but yeah. But I so this is my second book. And even though my first book is very, very different, my first book is about quantum physics, it's hard for me to answer that question without talking a little bit about the first book as well. Because I think the
Please.
first book is is a more normal book for a science journalist with a PhD in physics to write, right? A
Yes.
book about quantum physics. And when I went into science journalism after my PhD, I already knew, someday I'd like to write a book about quantum physics, because there were certain issues in the subject that were interesting to me, troubling to me, and I had gone looking for a good book about those ideas and that history and hadn't found it. And so then I thought, well, I would like to write that, and if I can actually make a successful career as a writer, maybe I can do that. And there's a long story about exactly how I ended up doing that, involving, all of the different nuts and bolts of getting a book deal and whatnot. But I did. And I was very lucky and worked very hard. And I think the luck was probably more important than the hard work, as is so often the case. Um, but then that book came out and it did well and people liked it. And I actually ended up being very satisfied with it, which can be unusual for me as a writer, and I think for many writers, we're often not satisfied with our writing when it's done. But I was pretty happy with that book. But while I was writing that book came out in 2018, but I got the deal for that book in 2015. And so I was deep into the writing of that book in late 2016 when Donald Trump was elected president for the first time. And I think unsurprisingly to anybody who's read my work, am no fan of Donald Trump. I think that he's a threat to democracy, um, and and all sorts of other problems with him and his ideas and his people. Um, and so when that happened, I had this sort of moment of crisis thinking, wait, what am I doing? I'm a journalist. I have this platform. I'm not, a big famous journalist, but I have some influence. And here I am writing a book about quantum physics while American democracy is falling apart. What am I doing with myself? And then, I took a step back and took a deep breath and said, okay, this book is it's happening. I wrote I signed the contract for it. I have to write it, and I'm already most of the way through it. I'm really enjoying writing this book. There's nothing wrong with me continuing to write this book, but I'm going to make myself a promise. If I write another book, I want it to be more directly politically relevant because I am really concerned about what I'm seeing in the world. And so I sort of kept that in the back of my mind. And at the time, the book was still, it wasn't even going to be out for another 18 months. I still wasn't even done writing it. And I thought, yeah, but, who knows if I even write a second book? Most books don't even do that well. And if this book doesn't do well, I'll just go back to, writing news articles. That'll be a better use of my time. And then to my surprise and delight, the first book did do well. It did very well for a book on quantum physics, which is, a different sort of scale, but whatever.
It's a challenging subject for a mass audience.
Yes, it is. And I set myself the task with that book of writing it without using any equations because I figured that, equations will scare people off. And it was primarily a story about ideas that I really felt could be expressed in words. And I did end up having to write one equation in that book, but I wrote it out in words because it was a relatively simple one. It was just 3 times 2 equals 2 times 3, which I felt was a concept that most people would understand if I just wrote it out like that. But yeah, so that book came out in 2018. It did well. And it did well enough that I thought, oh, okay, I guess I do have an opportunity to write a second book here. Everybody wants me to. And I think most of the people in my life expected me to write a sort of obvious follow-up to that book. And I went and talked with my publisher and my agent and said, that's not what I want to do. And they said, what do you want to do? I said, I need to think about that, but it's not going to be like the first book. It's going to be something pretty different. They said, that's okay, which is very kind and understanding. And so I went off and thought about it, and I just knew I wanted it to be more relevant and more immediately relevant. I think there is a political dimension to my first book, but it doesn't speak to the moment in the same way. And so I went off and thought about it for a while and started thinking about, okay, well, look, I'm not a politics journalist. I could write about science, and there's definitely a sort of denial of reality going on here, maybe something about science denial and politics, but that's also pretty well trod ground. Let me think about this some more. And then something very odd happened. After that first book, my first book is called What is Real. After What is Real came out, I got a lot of people asking me to write articles for them, which was lovely. And some of them were, big places with names that I knew well. And some of them were, people's personal blogs. And I said yes to some and no to others. And being a freelance journalist, I always said, look, if you can't pay me, I'm sorry, I can't do it. And one day I got an email from an online magazine that I'd never heard of that asked me to write for them and said that they could pay. And I said, okay, let me take a look at this. And I looked at their website, and at first it seemed fine. There was a well-known physicist on their board, and I saw a couple of names I sort of recognized on the front page, having written articles for them. And so I thought, oh, okay, this seems legit. Let me ask a few more questions. And so I asked some questions like, okay, what's the pay rate? What length of article would you want me to write? What would you want me to write about? And they gave me all the right answers to those questions and seemed very appealing. And then there was this little voice in the back of my head that said, hey, go back and look at the website again. Something's not quite right. And when I went back and looked at the website, I found what was not quite right. On the page, the about page for the site, same page where I'd seen that well-known physicist on the board, I saw a sentence in italics set off from everything else that said, we have no ideological, political, or religious agenda whatsoever. And I thought, oh, why do you need to say that? That's I think methinks you doth protest too much, right? This is just a little too insistent. What's going on here? What agenda is it exactly that you don't have? And so I did a little more digging and found a blog post written by a computer scientist, and also found some stuff on the website itself that told me what was actually happening. What was actually happening, which is, was not immediately obvious, is that if you dig into that website, you will find that, yes, most of the articles are either fine or just odd, but some of the science articles on that site promote a version of creationism and dismiss evolution. And there was also a little bit of climate change denial as well, just sort of as a treat, I guess, and a few other odd things. But the main thing was, evolution denial. And so I sort of took a step back, and then I wrote an email to the people who had invited me to write for them and said, I'm sorry, I can't do this. I have a conflict. And then I turned around and went to a different online magazine that I knew well, where I knew people who worked there, out of MIT, a place called Undark. And the reason I went to Undark was that Undark is not just interested in articles about science, but is interested in articles about the science media itself. So a kind of meta science journalism. And I went to them and said, look, here's a meta science journalism story for you. Here's this website that is, passing itself off as long form serious articles about science, but it's actually creating cover for creationism. And I'd like to figure out, where their money's coming from. And Undark said, yeah, if you can figure out where the money's coming from, you got yourself a story. And so I went digging, and I thought I knew where the money was going to be coming from, because the main guy behind the website was a guy affiliated with a place called the Discovery Institute, which is an intelligent design, creationism think tank. They were behind the push to put intelligent design in the schools in the US about 20, 25 years ago. And so I figured, oh, okay, that's where the money's coming from, probably, because the main guy is affiliated with that. And so I pulled up some tax records and made a couple phone calls and found where the money was coming from, all of it. And it was not coming from the Discovery Institute. All of it was coming from Peter Thiel. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So all of it was coming from the tech venture capitalist Peter Thiel, notorious for donating to a wide variety of hard right-wing libertarian causes. And that shocked me. I ended up writing the story. It was, a very strange thing to be working on. But while I was working on it, I thought, I think there's something more here. And after I was done and it was up and, the dust had settled, and I had, in fact, not gotten sued by Peter Thiel, because, of course, that was one of the things I was worried about. Once all of that had gone down, I thought, I've been thinking about science denial, but I've also lived out here in the Bay for a long time. I mean, now I've lived out here in the San Francisco Bay Area for what? About 13 years. At the time, I had already been living out here for 7 or 8 years, something like that. And I thought, yeah, you know, maybe science denial in Silicon Valley. And that started seeming like a more promising direction. And so I started talking about
It's
that with
kind of
people.
counterintuitive.
Yeah. No, it is. It absolutely is. I mean, the first question that I got from a lot of people was, wait, is there science denial in Silicon Valley? Because there's this idea, I think, that the leaders of the tech industry must know a lot about science because it's the tech industry. And the answer is, maybe some areas of science, but by and large, these people are not scientists. And there's a lot of things about science that they might think that they know, but they're wrong. I mean, honestly, they're often very wrong about technology as well. The leaders of tech companies are primarily business people, right? And they know about how to run a business, usually. um, I suppose there are even some exceptions to that, but they don't know, they don't have a science background. If they do, it's not something that they're working on, in their day-to-day life. Uh, and and they are not actually people building tech. They are running companies that are building tech, and that's an important distinction.
Yeah, to me, what's the kind of the part that annoys me with such powerful people or their kind of offshoots like that websites is when they profess their kind of they have no agenda and no
Yeah,
political or any other kind of agenda. And as a former political scientist myself, uh, one of the kind of almost axioms that we had in the Department of Political Science is that everything is political in one way or another, whether
yeah,
you like it or not. The food you eat, the car you drive, the place where you live, the people you hang out with, the TV programs that you watch, the books that you read, everything has the clothes that you wear, everything has some kind of political implications. And denying that is like sweeping it under the carpet, but doesn't make it, you know, not happening, doesn't make it unreal. Uh, so, and that kind of reminds me a little bit, but I want to come back to this later to the Techno Optimist Manifesto
yeah,
by Mark Andreessen. And I think somewhere there he's also putting the same kind of ridiculous claim that that piece of work is not political in any way,
yeah,
where
yeah. He does claim
in
that.
my
Yeah.
eyes, to my mind, it is 100% political.
Yes.
That, especially from a powerful person like that, and written in the kind of up in your face tone, quoting, by the way, fascist futurists like Marinetti and others all over the place, and actually proudly listing their names,
Yep.
which is a whole other story. But before we get to Mark Andreessen
Yes.
and the kind of the connection between the Techno Optimist Manifesto and the Fascist Manifesto, which was written by Marinetti,
Yeah.
uh, let's walk the journey from here to there.
Yeah.
So we have Peter Thiel funding all kinds of weird stuff,
Yep.
creationist websites, Hulk Hogan's taking down of Gawker,
Yep.
very famously. But how do we go from that those facts to more everything forever? What were the other ingredients that
Yeah.
kind of got your attention to move beyond just a story about Peter Thiel and expand it all the way to Silicon Valley?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's a good question because I thought when I came up with this idea of science denial in Silicon Valley, oh yeah, that's book two. That's it. But that's not really what I've written. That's not what More Everything Forever is really about. It is actually what I ended up getting a book contract for. But
Huh.
yeah, but as is so often the case when you're writing a piece of work, creative, nonfiction, whatever, uh, the work will change in the process of writing it. And what I discovered when I tried to write a book about science denial in Silicon Valley was that it just wasn't coming together the way that I wanted it to. I tried to write it for about a year and a half, something like that. And it just was not gelling the way that I needed it to. Like the narrative structure was broken. The characters were not working. It just wasn't coming together. And I was bashing my head against a wall trying to write it anyway. And the writing was just fighting me every step of the way. And eventually I sat down with my editor and said, I don't think this is working. We need to find a new approach. And he said, oh, I'm so glad you said that, because I was about to tell you the same thing, which is, yeah, my editor's excellent. I have nothing but good things to say about him. Well, there's one very annoying thing about him, which is he's almost always right. And that's really, really annoying. But what he pointed out, speaking of him almost always being right, he said, okay, is there a part of this book that you have planned that, you're more excited about? And I thought about that. And what I realized was, there was originally going to be a chapter in that book that was about sort of these ideas about the future that are very common in the tech industry that I thought were based on bad science. Ideas like the singularity, philosophies like effective altruism, rationalism, effective accelerationism, uh, and like other ideas like space colonization. And then I thought that was a chapter or two in the new book. And in talking about it,
Populating Mars and creating a backup for humanity.
oh, yeah. Yeah. And so talking with my editor and thinking about it, I
Actually, I
realized,
apologize. That was a misphrasing. Populating is the word I use, but
yeah,
Elon uses colonizing, and
yes, he
most
does.
others use the word colonizing.
Yes, that's true. They do. And I think it's important that they use that word. But
Yeah.
yeah, uh, I, so yeah, I ended up, taking some time talking with my editor, talking with a couple of other people, sitting down and working on this and finding, oh, really, this is a book about the bad ideas that tech billionaires and the sort of subcultures and philosophies that they fund have about the future. And once I framed it that way and started writing what I thought was, one chapter in this old book, I realized, no, this is an entirely new book. And these one or two chapters are, in fact, you know, 6 or 7 chapters and a whole book unto themselves. And that's the book. And that was it.
So the book is about the bad ideas, as you just said, but
Yeah.
on the surface of it, just looking at the cover of your book, those
Yeah.
bad ideas are things like AI overlords, space empires, and the crusade to control the fate of humanity.
Yeah.
Okay, so where should we start? Which one should we attempt to unpack first? Let's perhaps start with the most popular topic in the last couple of years,
Yep.
AI.
Yeah.
And I think the AI overlords came from a game of Jeopardy where the human champion was defeated by Watson. And in his final sort of scribble, he wrote something to the effect of, I, for one, welcome our AI overlords. So if I remember, that's kind of the origin. I mean, I'm sure there's many others from science fiction for decades and decades, if not 50, 60, 100 years from before that. But that's kind of like the
Mhm.
more 21st century moment that happened. So what's what makes AI a bad idea? I mean, we're giving Nobel Prizes left, right, and center.
Yep.
Jeffrey Hinton got one,
Yep.
Demis Hassabis got another for absolutely groundbreaking work.
Mhm.
Work like, for example, protein folding,
Yeah.
which has the potential to save the lives of millions upon millions of people,
Yeah.
make our lives safer and more comfortable, and
Hmm.
extend human longevity by a considerable amount of time, possibly not just years, but maybe even decades,
Yeah.
if
No,
not
that's
more.
yeah.
So,
Sure.
what's wrong with AI? Why is it a bad idea?
Well, I don't even think.
Is it?
Yeah, I don't think AI is a bad idea. I just think that there are a lot of bad ideas about AI. Uh, you know, I
That's a
think
very important distinction. Let me just highlight it.
yeah.
That's where we agree very much too. That I also don't think AI is a bad idea. I think that just many of the ideas that come wrapped up as inevitable, uh, almost teleologically predetermined in the same box with AI are where the danger lies. And I've been trying to highlight that for a decade.
Yeah. I think that's right. Um, there's just a lot of ideas in the tech industry among leaders in AI research, like Jeffrey Hinton and Demis Hassabis, uh, that AI is going to inevitably, and some of these people, like say Sam Altman, say soon, lead to super intelligent AGI, that it will reach the level of intelligence of a human and then surpass it and eventually surpass the combined intelligence of our entire human civilization. And at that point, the AI will have godlike powers of creation, destruction, and transformation. And then either it will usher in a paradise or it will kill us all. And I think that that entire narrative of the inevitable and possibly imminent future of AI is based on so many specious assumptions and poorly defined terms that there's essentially no reason to believe it.
I've actually had a bunch of science fiction, famous classic science fiction authors on my podcast, not just like Cory Doctorow, but
Yeah,
Greg Bear.
yeah,
And he said that the singularity is a Christian apotheosis.
yeah,
Greg Bear did.
yeah,
Even people like Charlie Strauss, who wrote famous books like Accelerando, when
yeah.
I interviewed him in 2011 or so, he shocked me. Charlie shocked me that the author of Accelerando is not really a singularitarian.
No, he's not. Yeah,
So how do we unpack this further? So I've tried in the past of some of my interviews kind of break down this kind of a teleology of unfolding of the universe that Ray Kurzweil talks about, where the universe ultimately wakes up,
yeah,
and where we're inevitably moving in the cosmos from less to more intelligence with the ultimate stage of the universe waking up. But it just occurs to me that, I'm just a petty, silly amateur. You're kind of the cosmologist here. So you tell me, because this is a cosmological, teleological timeline about the predetermined development of our entire universe. As a
yeah.
cosmologist yourself, how do you view this kind of a, was it the seven steps towards the universe waking up? I'm forgetting how many steps Ray Kurzweil had, but the ultimate one is where we have smart dust and the universe wakes up. So
Yep.
you're the cosmologist. What's wrong with this?
Yeah, I mean, Kurzweil says that like the goal of the singularity is to wake up the universe and take control of its cosmic evolution. And there are a lot of things wrong with this, right? I mean, as a cosmologist, Kurzweil assumes over and over again that this law of accelerating returns that he postulates, this idea that, technology will build on itself and make itself more and more complicated and powerful, um, he sort of takes that as the fundamental thing in the universe, more fundamental than anything else, essentially. Uh, even the laws of physics. And
Maybe it's also more fundamental to that, and that's my reading on him, is that the movement from less to more intelligence,
yeah, mm-hmm,
right? So we had a universe that was dumb, stupid, then and dead.
mm-hmm,
Then eventually we had life in the universe, but that life was kind of unicellular and very dumb. Then life got a little more complex and became multicellular, but still kind of dumb. Then eventually we started having biological intelligence. Then eventually we're starting to have technological intelligence, which is where we find ourselves right now. Then eventually we're going to have artificial intelligence. Then that process is going to continue on and on and on and on until finally, we have matryoshka brains, giant computroniums, smart dust, and the universe wakes up, which is the ultimate inevitable stage.
yeah. Yeah, I think there are a lot of problems with this, right? Like it is a very teleological view, right? This idea that there's a goal. Uh, I went, one of the things that didn't make it into the book was I went and talked with a friend of mine who's a genomicist about Kurzweil's ideas about evolution. He's like, Kurzweil's completely misunderstood evolution, the role of complexity in evolution. But just on a very surface level, like evolution has no goal. The universe has no goal. Insofar as there is anything vaguely resembling a goal, it's to maximize entropy. And yes, there's a relationship between entropy and information, but the ultimate high entropy state of the universe, the fate of the universe, is to have everything the same, right? The ultimate high entropy state, the heat death, is for a relentlessly uniform universe with the same density of the same mix of particles everywhere.
And by
And
the way, the word telos comes from Aristotle.
yeah,
Here, my philosophy background can help. And when he was talking about a telos of something, he was talking about, for example, the telos of a knife is to be sharp.
yeah,
So, therefore, if a knife is not sharp, a knife cannot accomplish its purpose, which is to cut. And
yeah,
if a knife cannot cut, it's not really a good knife.
yeah,
Therefore, it fails its telos. And therefore, and he expanded that idea, or people be after Aristotle expanded that idea until we find ourselves today with a telos of the entire universe, which is represented by Ray Kurzweil's kind of claim evolutionary direction of our entire universe.
yeah, exactly. And the thing is, like, Aristotle was not wrong about the telos of a knife, right? But that's because the knife is a created object that, was created with a specific intention. That is not the universe that we're in. But and this brings us back to, what Greg Bear said. Like, there is something very Christian, uh, and apocalyptic about this, right? The idea of having like smart dust eat the universe, which there's all sorts of technological problems with that as well, like the problems with like the Drexler idea of nanotech that's sort of built on. But even if you seed that, give that to Kurzweil, he's still essentially destroying the universe and replacing it with a giant computer. And so it's the destruction of this world and the advent of the world to come. And filling the universe with technological structures without regard for the beauty of nature, without regard for other creatures that could already be there. Kurzweil is so sure that the singularity is so inevitable and so universal that he takes the lack of smart dust in the universe right now as proof that there are no aliens. I think that's just a phenomenal act of arrogance.
Yeah, and by the way, a good singularitarian and transhumanist might answer by saying that this is kind of like destroying the body to allow the mind upload to live forever. It's the
Sure.
same idea of the universe, right?
Yeah.
What's wrong with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think what's wrong with that? Well, with the destroying the body to upload the mind, I think we are our bodies, right? There's this idea of embodied intelligence. The body is not a spacesuit for the mind, or for the brain, the nervous system. And the mind does not like haunt the body and brain. The mind is a thing that happens in the body and brain. The mind is a process, right? And this is like just the best understanding that we have of neuroscience right now, is that we are our bodies in our environment. If you remove the body and the environment, you're not left with enough for there to be a mind. And there's not any good scientific evidence that mind uploading is possible. Like we don't have answers to seemingly basic questions, like about the brain, uh like, oh, what's the processing speed of the brain, what's the memory capacity of the brain, in bytes. And at first this seems like a
Ray Kurzweil
statement.
has said it's 10 to the 16th, like in the singularity is near, which was almost 20 years ago.
That's right. Yeah, Kurzweil has an estimate, but Kurzweil's not a neuroscientist. And if you go and look at like the best neuroscience, the best cognitive science, there's not a good agreed upon answer to that. There's even, acknowledgement of that among people who are like way more ideologically aligned with Kurzweil than I am. Like there's a paper from Nick Bostrom, and I don't remember who it was with. It might have been Stuart Armstrong, which contained various estimates for what the theoretical maximum uh, memory capacity of the brain was, but and I think processing speed. But they said in the paper, like, we do not know the answer to this. And they may have even said in that paper the same thing that like good neuroscientists will say, which is, we don't have an answer to this because the question is not particularly well posed. It's not that we don't know enough about the brain, though there is a lot that we don't know about the brain. It's that asking that question in that way assumes that the brain is a lot more like a computer than it actually is.
I think the paper is by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. I had Hameroff on my podcast, and of course, Roger Penrose is a Nobel laureate, and they're talking about the quantum theory of consciousness. I think if it's the same paper that you're referring to, and they're giving a
It's not, but
uh, variety of different estimations about what's the processing power of the neurons and or the brain in general. And Hameroff, in my interview, said that it's a great insult to call a neuron a binary kind of transistor,
yeah,
because it's a lot more than that, in his opinion. Now, mind you, Penrose and Hameroff are a minority opinion, especially in uh, neuroscience nowadays. But
yes,
however, since my interview, which has been almost, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago, there's been a growing evidence that there may be some quantum effects at the microtubular level, maybe. But anyway,
yeah,
okay, so but someone would say, okay, fine, maybe Kurzweil is wrong about or is kind of too eager to embrace this kind of a directionality of the entire universe, which serves him with respect to intelligence. But what about his predictions? I mean, Bill Gates, Tony Robbins, and a bunch of others have gone on the record to say that he's the best person who has ever been able to kind of predict the future,
yeah,
in their opinion. And he's gone on the record to put out a timeline to artificial intelligence, which we should be approaching at 2028, and the singularity and or artificial general intelligence by 2045.
yep.
So what do you think of sort of kind of zooming down from the cosmological level of the universe to kind of just our planetary civilizational technological development.
Yeah. I mean, one of the advantages that we have now for answering questions like that is that relative to Kurzweil's earlier writing, we are in the future, right? The singularity is near, probably his most famous book, was published, I think, almost exactly 20 years ago
Yeah.
in 2005. And The Age of Spiritual Machines, I think, was 1999, something around there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
7, 8, 9, somewhere there. Yeah.
Yeah, somewhere in there, late 90s. Yeah. Um, Now, it's certainly true that Kurzweil has made some accurate predictions, but he's also made some really inaccurate predictions. And that's been true for a long time, right? Kurzweil will tell you that his accuracy is something like 80%, I think. But there have been other independent estimates of the accuracy of his predictions that go back, like these estimates go back to at least, I think, 2010, maybe a bit earlier, and they come up with a much lower number. Um, but if you just take a look at the singularity is near now, you will find many predictions that are just incorrect. Kurzweil predicted that by now we would have really robust brain computer interfaces. That has not happened. I mean, like we've got like some, but not like the kind that Kurzweil's talking about. Kurzweil said that nanotech would have completely transformed manufacturing by now. And I mean Drexler style nanotech, like engines of creation style nanotech. That has not happened. And there are good reasons for that. Drexler style nanotech is widely dismissed with good reason by serious researchers in nanoscale physics and chemistry, because that sort of mechanistic idea of mechanistic's not the right word, mechanical idea of how like nanoscale systems work is not really correct. Um, and um, and I mean, Kurzweil said that we would have like synapse level in vivo brain scans by now. And in
Yeah.
fact, the fidelity of our best in vivo brain scans right now is not significantly better than it was in 2005. And Kurzweil said that that was going to follow an exponential trend like everything. And I mean, this is like the core of the problem with Kurzweil's predictions, which is that when Kurzweil sees an exponential trend, he just assumes it's going to continue. Whereas when you see any exponential trend in nature and technology, whatever, your assumption should be, oh, that can't last. The one thing we know is always true of exponential trends is that they will not go on forever. They will end. I mean, Kurzweil looks at Moore's law and says it's going to continue forever. Moore looked at Moore's law
Yeah.
and said it's not going to continue forever. It's going to stop somewhere around 2025. And lo, he was right. By most serious estimates, Moore's law is either already ended or on the verge of ending. And you'll notice that processor clock speeds have not gone up in a while. So yeah, or at least consumer processor clock speeds. Whereas I remember, as recently as 10, 15 years ago, those were going up very reliably in accordance with the consequences of Moore's law. Like,
Peter
yeah,
Diamandis would answer that the number of transistors that you're getting to place in a microprocessor, in a CPU, is increasing. And the two examples usually given right now are beyond CPUs like Intel, but
yep,
the leaders are supposed to be either Apple with their phone microchips
yep,
or NVIDIA with
yep.
their sort of video graphics microchips, which are kind of the hardware foundation of artificial intelligence.
Absolutely. But I would respond to that by saying, look, yes, it's true that Moore's law is not about clock speeds. It's about how many transistors you can cram onto a single chip. And it's also true that number has continued to go up. It is starting to falter, though. So first of all, there's the like price version of Moore's law, which Moore also postulated, saying that the price per transistor was going to go down, up to a certain point. We're already done with that. That's gone. That point, the minimum point of cost per transistor, is in the past. The process of cramming more transistors onto each chip, though, so that is
I think
still
we're at
going.
the 2 nanometers now,
I think that's about right. Maybe even a little bit smaller. And the thing is,
1.5, something like that.
yeah, that's right. And like the hard limit is, somewhere around between a tenth of a nanometer and a nanometer, right? Because that's when you get to the size of an individual atom, and you cannot make transistor out of one atom. And we're essentially at that limit. And so the way that we're cramming more transistors into the same space is actually by putting them on top of each other. And that will work for a time, but you can't continue Moore's law indefinitely that way, because yes, you can get better at making the layers thinner and thinner, but we're already approaching the limits on that as well. And so if you want exponential increase in the number of transistors you're cramming into the same space, that way eventually you're going to have exponentially increasing heights of your chips, and that's not going to work. And the same thing is true even if you're looking at phones or GPUs. I mean, look at the reason we're using GPUs for AI in the first place is precisely because Moore's law is coming to an end. We need these custom chip designs because we can't rely anymore on just the seemingly inevitable march of miniaturization and speed that we were able to rely on for the past 50 years.
Yeah, and to me, by the way, one of the best representation of that is power consumption.
Yeah.
And you can see that at the consumer level. So, for example, I'm the kind of guy who builds my own computers here.
Yep.
And, I choose and pick the best single components when I build a new system. And, my systems run a long time because I pick the best. So they're usually 6 or 7 years old when I replace them. And I always run a benchmark of the old machine and the new machine when I replace it. And I've been amazed that, if we're generous, if Moore's law is correct, when I run a benchmark of my old machine, which is like 6.5, 7 years old, I should have 2 to the power of 3 or something, if not 4, which is to say at least 8 times, if not 16 times more powerful machine. When I run the benchmark, that's never the case. Usually it's about a factor of 2, if I'm lucky, a factor of 3. But when we do that kind of math, we have to keep everything else equal.
Yeah.
And we are not, because what's happening is every time I upgrade my machine, and sometimes I upgrade the video card halfway through the cycle of upgrading the machine, I have to buy a new power supply. So I remember the days when I had a 100-watt power supply. Now I have a 1200-watt power supply in my desktop, right? My wife's computer that I bought her laptop, the previous models used to have like a 70-watt little power supply for her little laptop. Now it's a brick that's 250 watts to be able to supply the energy for her GPU and her CPU. So we can see that at the consumer level, we can't make the same calculation with the same energy expense that
Yeah.
we had before. Even if monetarily we are thinking, oh, it's Moore's law is still sustaining, the energy it takes to do those calculations is a lot more. It's growing up almost exponentially. And
Yep.
the best way to see that is in the world of AI, where companies like Microsoft have to have a decade long contract with and restart nuclear power plants to be
Yeah.
able to supply the energy requirements they need for the next training rounds for their AI.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And it's really It's really remarkable to see the way that a lot of these sort of tech leaders talk about energy consumption, right? You've got
Peter
Sam Alt.
Diamandis says that all problems eventually come to energy, and once we have energy abundance, we would be able to solve all of our problems in his
Yeah,
book called Abundance.
yeah, and I just think that that's not true, right? I mean, like putting aside whether we get to energy abundance, there are some problems that are irreducibly political. You could put all of the power plants that you want in say the Middle East, you're still going to have the Israel-Palestine conflict. You can't solve that conflict through application of energy abundance. That's a conflict that's irreducibly about like culture and people and land and
AI
politics.
would solve that in a day.
Oh man, there are people who believe that, but I think that the evidence for that is really pretty bad. Like there are people
I mean,
talking about the
all problems that humanity is facing today would be solved by intelligence which is incomprehensibly smarter, more powerful than we are. Come on now. Isn't that obvious?
Yeah. I don't believe that, because I don't believe first of all, I don't believe that the concept of intelligence is well defined enough that we can talk about something having, an intelligence way beyond that of our entire society. I don't think that that's like a coherent concept. Uh, but I also think that many very smart people and large groups of very smart people have tried to solve all sorts of problems, and the problem is not a lack of intelligence being applied to some of these problems. Like you know my favorite example for this, and this is kind of boring but I think important, is climate change. Right, climate change is a problem that it used to be that we didn't really have the technology on hand to solve it, and there's still some tech that we need that we don't have on hand, like efficient carbon capture on a large scale is not something that we have the tech for. It is something that it seems like we might get if we, get lucky and
Soil
invest in the right way.
regeneration can play that role, by the way.
What'd you say?
Soil regeneration.
Yeah.
Regenerating soil captures tremendous amount of CO2.
Yes, that's true. And hopefully that will be enough. But what we needed, the big thing that we needed for a long time that we didn't have, that we have now, is cheap, clean energy. We have that. Uh, and so the problem is not primarily technological. The problem is political. The problem is like gathering the political will to deploy the solutions that we already have, or the technological solutions that we already have. And finding a way to do that has been incredibly difficult, not just in the US, but around the world. And like coordinating the international effort and all of that. And that is not a problem that lacks for intelligence applied to it. That is a problem of political persuasion, right? You could have some super genius, even if I'm wrong about like the idea of intelligence being so well defined, which I don't think I am. If you had a super intelligent AI and it said, oh, yeah, this is how you do it, you would need to get the people who live in the places that you need to deploy this stuff to accept that solution. And they won't, not until you persuade them. And that's turned out to be very hard.
Yeah, to me, by the way, it's been over a decade since I wrote an article, and it's had several versions since its original inception. And that's because, as a philosopher, I got annoyed at some point by the kind of singularity idea that technology is the silver bullet for all of our problems.
Yeah.
And so I wrote, and that's part of the thesis of my blog: is technology is not enough. It
No.
is necessary, but it is insufficient.
Yeah.
And the metaphor I came up with is like, imagine that you're an alcoholic, and you have liver disease eventually because you're doing all kinds of drugs and doing ridiculous amounts of alcohol on a regularly basis, and eventually your liver starts giving in, so you have liver disease until eventually your liver fails. This is what our civilization is kind of like today. But instead of changing our own behavior, what we're hoping to do is to 3D print a new liver and replace it so that we can go right back to doing the same drugs and the same drinking than before, while
Yeah.
failing to acknowledge that the new liver can kind of give us a little bit more time, but ultimately the fundamental problem is our own behavior.
Yeah.
And therefore, that's where the ultimate fundamental solution lies. Everything else would be a band aid, temporary kind of a solution.
Yep. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And there are just some problems that are irreducibly political, sociological, interpersonal in nature, and you can't get around those with technology. And you can't ever escape politics and sociology, because even if you send lots and lots of people to Mars or space, there's going to emerge politics in those places. It's just a natural consequence of getting enough people in one place who all have to, live in a shared space like we do here on Earth. And there's no way around that. Also, do you watch the TV show Futurama?
I don't watch TV. I apologize.
Okay.
I
No, it's
haven't
okay.
owned a TV for 20 years.
That is a good call. But there is the thing that you were saying about the liver. Uh, Reminded me of something from Futurama. There's an episode of that show about climate change, and it takes place in the future, like 1,000 years in the future. And so the way that they say that climate change has been solved is every year there is a large shipment of ice from the outer solar system. And each year that shipment of ice is larger and larger. And they say, and so each year the shipment is larger and larger and larger, thus solving the problem forever.
Wow.
And like that's not how anything works,
I
like
mean,
which
comets
is
are
the
made of
joke. But
ice,
yeah.
or at least some of them, supposedly.
Right, exactly. And like, putting aside that this wouldn't work because among other things, water is a really efficient greenhouse gas. But yeah, like it's a good joke. But yeah, I think your liver analogy is exactly right. You have to go after the fundamental problem. And that's not technology. But this is like a core piece of all of these different ideologies that I talk about in my book, that that technology solves everything. And
Isn't that
and it's
what's
not.
sometimes referred to as engineering disease, or a different
Yeah.
kind of version? Tell me
Yeah,
about
it's
that.
definitely. Yeah, it's like a component of engineer's disease. Like engineer's disease, I think is more broadly the idea that like if you are an expert in one technical area in engineering or STEM, that makes you an expert in everything, because you already know how to solve really difficult problems in one particular area. And that means you know how to solve all difficult problems. And of course, that's not how the world works or how difficult problems work. There is such a thing as domain expertise. And if you have extreme domain expertise in one area or even a few areas, that does not mean that you're generally intelligent, right? Like, or generally able to solve problems in all domains. Like, I'm a physicist by training and a journalist by trade. I went and talked with experts in lots of different areas to write this book, and then hired a fact checker to make sure that I got everything right. Because despite the fact that I know a lot of physics and know a lot about writing, that does not make me, an expert in everything.
Yeah. So, unfortunately, you're breaking my heart, and you're telling me that if you can send spaceships to space, you can't fix the flaws of government somehow.
Yeah.
That I don't know. That's kind of like, I mean, didn't we solve that?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the seductive dreams of certain kinds of science fiction, and I guess now we're moving away from AI and toward space. But one of the seductive dreams of science fiction, and especially one of my favorite pieces of science fiction, Star Trek, is that the idea that we will be a better version of ourselves and not have to like deal with the same kinds of political struggles that we're currently dealing with once we're out in space. And that's, I think, a very common reading of Star Trek, but I don't even think that that's what Star Trek is saying, right? Because Star Trek is very clearly about where we are here and now, right? It's social commentary on where we are now. And it does not present a world free of conflict. It presents an idea of a better future, and it uses space as the setting for that. But the point is to talk about like who we are now and where we are. And there's so many very direct and clear analogies in Star Trek, every single series, that make that very clear. Like even back in the original series, the episode where you've got, one guy whose face is half white and half black, and the other guy whose face is half black and half white on the other sides. And they, have a lot of racial strife. And one of them is like a cop chasing the other one around the galaxy until their entire civilization is destroyed by racial strife. And that's an episode that aired in the US in 1968. So, a year of great turmoil in the US. I think that this is, like just anyone who thinks that the show is fundamentally about space is just mistaken. But I also
I think
think,
Cory Doctorow and Greg Bear said it well on my podcast when one said that sci-fi, because I've asked all of the science fiction guests on my show to define what sci-fi is and tell
yeah,
me what it's all about.
yeah,
And I mean, Charlie Strauss was about lying about the future or something like that, about
yeah,
creating plausible stories about implausible scenarios or something. But Corey said that science fiction is usually a reflection or a mirror of the present, and it's
yeah,
all about the present in some ways. And Greg Bear was talking about the sugar coated pill, how somewhere within the subtext of a sci fi story, there are all these prescriptive, not just descriptive, but kind of somewhat prescriptive ideas about maybe things we should do and maybe things we shouldn't do, or at least consider.
yeah. I think that there's a way in which all three of them are right, right? Um, but I think that a lot of the problem that we have is that these tech billionaires and these subcultures that they fund, uh, and philosophies that they fund, take these science fictional visions of the future as a very serious literal blueprint or roadmap of what the future could or should look like, rather than the setting for a story that is, going after something deeper and more subtle. And so you end up with Elon Musk saying, oh, we need to go to Mars to save humanity as a backup. And uh
But isn't that a noble kind of a hero, sort of a generous idea that we should all support in a way? It's
no,
like a philanthropy at its best. I mean, Peter Diamandis, in his book Abundance, talks about the new techno philanthropists.
yep,
And those are, of course, Mark Zuckerberg, the Google guys, Jeff Bezos, and most recently, Elon Musk,
yep,
the techno philanthropists. And those are the people for Peter who would save us.
yeah. I once again do not agree with Peter Diamandis. I think so. A couple of things. First of all, he's not alone in saying that these are philanthropic efforts. He's not alone in saying that Musk's ambition to put 1 million people on Mars as a backup for humanity is a philanthropic effort. Larry Page said something very similar about Musk specifically. Uh, there are problems with billionaire philanthropy, which we can get to later in the conversation. I'm going to put that aside for a second and just focus on Musk's vision for Mars and tech billionaire visions for space, just for a minute here. Well, probably more than a minute, but I, Musk talks about, he's very, very clear and specific and surprisingly consistent about this. He's not consistent about which launch window he's going to send something to Mars in, but he has been saying for years he wants to put 1 million people on Mars by 2050 as a backup for humanity in the event of a massive extinctional level event here on Earth, like a massive asteroid collision like the one that hit 66 million years ago and killed off all of the dinosaurs except for the birds. Um, and this sounds like a grand plan, right? Like a grand vision.
It's like don't put all your eggs in one basket kind of logic.
Yeah, except that it doesn't work. Mars is terrible. Mars is just absolutely unremittingly awful. The gravity is too low. The radiation levels are too high. There's no air, and the dirt is made of poison. And these are not even all of the problems with Mars. Uh, it is a radically inhospitable place, uh, filled with so many very, very serious, intractable or near intractable problems that it is phenomenally unlikely that you could get any long term, large scale human habitation of that place. I mean, we have places here on Earth that are way, 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 way more habitable than Mars. And I mean, way more habitable. Places like the Antarctic interior during the Antarctic night, or the very top of Mount Everest. Those are both places where it is much, much, much easier to survive than on Mars.
Or the bottom of the ocean, maybe.
The bottom of the ocean, the deep interior of deserts like the Sahara or the Australian outback, right? There are so many places like the empty quarter in the Arabian Peninsula. There are so many places here on Earth where it is so much easier to live, where people do not live, or at least do not live in large numbers in permanent settlements and structures. It is it is just indisputably easier to live in those places. There is an abundance of oxygen, water, uh, food. The temperature range is extreme, but is still way, way closer to the temperature range that we need as humans than anywhere on Mars.
Okay,
Uh,
so Mars is inhospitable, but tell me a little bit more about sort of the transportation challenge.
yeah,
What kind of energy are we talking about here? And what's the kind of infrastructure that we need to create and the energy to consume to be able to send 1 million people from here to there? And I mean, to be self sufficient, is 1 million people even enough?
yeah, exactly. I mean, there's all sorts of problems. So think for a minute about 1 million, right? That's a lot of people. You want to send 1 million people to Mars and have 1 million people there by 2050. Uh, so that means that they're basically all going to have to come from Earth. You're not going to reproduce enough to have that many people on Mars. And we'll get back to reproduction in a second. It's pretty important. Uh, but say that you're sending 1 million people to Mars by 2050. Um, generously, generously, one of those, you could imagine a rocket that could maybe fit, let's say, 100 people on it. Okay. Which is, you know, more people than have ever been on one, you know, rocket going into space by more than a factor of 10. I think the largest crew of any single space mission is something like 7 or 8.
7 or 8. Yeah.
Yeah. But say that you had 100, and that's already phenomenally unlikely, even
And they
just to
have to
go
be
into.
together for 6 or 9 months or something.
Exactly. That's the thing. And you got to feed them and everything for 6 or 9 months. It's phenomenally unlikely that you'd actually be able to put that many people into one rocket, even just for a suborbital flight, much less for the 6 to 9 months that it takes to get to Mars. But say
Supply
that you
air and water to get there,
and
but
food.
also when they're there, because you
Exactly.
don't have it there.
Right. But say you've got 100 people on each launch, then you still need 10,000 launches just to get 1 million people to Mars. Just. Um, but yeah, it takes 6 to 9 months to get there. It takes roughly the same amount of time to get back. Uh, you can't go for a short visit unless you want to take a longer and stranger and more harrowing trip back through the inner solar system. Once you're there, you're like, if you don't want to do that and you want to take the same kind of route back, you're committed to being there for something like at least a year. Um, you're in deep space for most of that. And when you're on the surface of Mars, you're still essentially in deep space. Your radiation shielding on the ship and on the surface of Mars is all pretty bad. And you would need to dig tunnels under the surface because here on Earth we've got two main things protecting us from radiation at the surface. We have our magnetosphere, which keeps a lot of charged particles from even reaching the surface of the Earth.
The Earth's magnetic field.
Yeah, exactly. The Earth's magnetic field. And we have a thick atmosphere that stops a lot of radiation before it hits the surface, which is why, if you're on an airplane flight, you get a slightly higher radiation dose than you do if you're on the ground because you're slightly higher up in the atmosphere. Mars has neither of those things. It has an atmosphere that's less than 1% as thick as Earth's, and it has no magnetic field to speak of. And so the radiation that hits the surface of Mars is essentially the same as the radiation that you get in deep space, which is pretty bad under normal circumstances and real bad if you get something like a solar flare. And so you would need to dig tunnels under the surface in order to protect yourself from that radiation, which is a problem because the Martian dust will get everywhere, and the Martian dust is filled with toxic chemicals like perchlorates. Now, Musk talks about trying to terraform Mars, but there's no viable plan to do that, and there are problems that you still can't solve, even if you somehow raise the temperature, give it a thicker atmosphere, put oxygen into that atmosphere. Even if you solve all of those problems, you've still got low gravity, you've still got no magnetosphere, and so you're still going to have a higher radiation dose at the surface, and you're going to have lower gravity, and both of those are problems potentially for reproduction on Mars, right? You want to be pregnant and have kids and raise kids on Mars, which you would need to do if you're going to have a city of 1 million people on Mars. That's going to be a problem both because you got the higher radiation doses and because we do not know what effects 1/3 Earth gravity, which is Martian gravity, has on the process of conception, gestation, and then child growth. We do not know what it would do. And the tests that would need to be done in order to answer that question are both phenomenally expensive because you can't conduct those anywhere other than the surface of Mars itself. You can't simulate 1/3 gravity here on Earth or in Earth orbit. And on top of that, they'd be very unethical. But
In
even
what
if you
way?
solve, sorry.
In what way would they be unethical?
I mean, the child that you would need to use as a test subject has no ability to consent to the test. They would be born into the world as a test subject without any ability to say whether or not they'd be willing to risk their lives to answer this question. But even if you solve all of those problems and all of the other problems I haven't even mentioned, you've got another problem, which is that 1 million people on the surface of Mars is not enough to be self-sufficient. Musk wants it to be a backup for humanity. He's been really, really clear. He said the people there, the 1 million people on Mars, have to survive even if the rockets from Earth stop coming. A low-tech civilization is not an option for survival on Mars because of all of these problems. You can't be a hunter-gatherer on Mars. Mars, you can't be like a subsistence farmer on Mars. You have to be part of a big interconnected high-tech civilization if you want to be self-sufficient on Mars, without relying on rockets from Earth. The best economic estimates of the civilization, the size of the population needed to sustain an independent high-tech civilization is somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion people. We are not going to have 500 million or 1 billion people living on Mars. We are not even going to have 1 million people living on Mars. And my favorite thing in all of this is that risk of asteroid that Musk talks about, because sure, yeah, that's a real thing, but 2 points. First of all, Mars gets hit with more asteroids than Earth does. It's closer to the asteroid belt. Okay. Second, and of course, it's got a thinner atmosphere, so more of those asteroids make it to the surface. But second, worst single day in the history of complex life on Earth was the day that asteroid hit here 66 million years ago. We've had worse mass extinctions in the history of complex life on Earth, but they were not single day events the way that one was. They were usually, longer scale, though still very short in the geologic and evolutionary timescale. That asteroid was what? It was the size of Brooklyn. It was going 10 times faster than a passenger jet when it hit the surface or something like that. Maybe even faster. I don't remember the exact figure. It was fast. It released an enormous amount of energy. There was, a firestorm around the world. There were animals that got cooked at the surface just from the heat of the re-entering debris around the world. It kicked up an enormous amount of material into the upper atmosphere, which cut off sunlight, which cut out the bottom from the food chain, and that killed anything that survived. Something like 75 to 80% of all species went extinct. Something like over 99% of all individual living organisms at the time died. So you've got less than a 1% chance, maybe a 0.1% chance of surviving if you are any living being on Earth at the time that asteroid hits. Say that an asteroid like that is bearing down on Earth and we know it's going to hit in a month and there's no way to stop it. And say that at that point we also have a city on Mars. Say that it's even a city of 1 million people, like Musk is talking about, somehow. And say that you're given a choice. And you have to make this choice not to, satisfy personal preference, but to maximize the chances of your own long-term survival. You're
I'll
given a
take
choice
Earth
to.
any day, but that's
Yeah,
just me.
exactly. Yeah,
That's because I'm old school. I'm like
right.
very old fashioned.
Yeah, I would take Earth too, but if you were told no, you have to make the choice that maximizes your chances of survival in that situation, stay on Earth or go to the 1 million people city on Mars. The correct answer, there is a correct answer, and the correct answer is stay on Earth, because almost everyone on Earth is going to die. But everyone on Mars will die, because when that asteroid hits, the rockets will stop coming from Earth and they will probably never come back. And so everyone on Mars will starve.
Yeah. If they get air at all and water and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah, they will starve or asphyxiate or
Yeah.
yeah, it will not be pretty.
Not to mention
And
their
yeah.
existence would be horrible because they'll be locked up in very
Oh
tight
God.
corners,
Yeah.
in very tight quarters. That I mean, you can't go for a walk. You can't do anything. There's no outdoors really.
No, yeah. I mean, look, I think that we probably, if we decided that we didn't care how many astronauts we killed along the way, we could probably build a small settlement on Mars of, I don't know, like a dozen people or something like that. Obviously be completely dependent on rockets from Earth and whatnot. But like we could have like some sort of permanent thing there. We could definitely do that on the moon. Again, if we didn't care how many people died along the way, which I think we should. But both the moon or Mars, the way that you're going to do that is you're going to have people living in tunnels underground. They're never going to go outside for very long because the radiation levels are too high and the temperature is too low and there's no air. Or temperature's too low or too high in certain cases on the moon. I it would be just a relentlessly depressing experience. It would, you'd be trapped in tunnels underground. You never go outside, like you were saying. If you're on Mars, you can't even have real-time conversations with people on Earth because the light speed lag, even at its smallest, is something like 8 minutes, I think, and at its longest is something more like 45. And so you can't have a real-time conversation. On the moon, you can have a real-time conversation. It would be like a slightly annoying, laggy cell phone call because the delay is something more like 1 or 2 seconds.
Yeah.
So you can live with that as long as you just get used to taking a pause at the end of talking, unlike me. But like, but yeah, but even on the moon, where like we know how to get people to the moon, we know how to get them back safely. It's hard and it's difficult, but we know how to do that. but like even there, you've got problems like the lunar regolith, the dust on the moon. It got into every single system on every single Apollo mission that landed, and it caused all kinds of very serious operational problems to the point where every single Apollo mission was, operating at its operational limits because of that dust in large part. Like, this stuff on the
For a
moon.
very short period of time, mind you.
Yes, exactly. Even the
Nothing was
longest
permanent. We're talking days,
exactly. The longest Apollo mission was still spent like what, I think 4 days on the moon, if
something
that.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course it takes, much less time to get to the moon than it does to Mars, and you don't have to worry about a launch window. It's always right there. It's just
By
3
the way,
days.
space is a great example of failed exponentials.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
because lots of people were looking at and who are kind of still going along the Kurzweil exponentials, and
Yeah.
you can kind of cherry pick the data and give many examples where we have had such exponentials, but
Yep.
there are many notable examples where that has failed miserably. So for example, people saw, the Wright brothers, and how, by the 1920s we flew from New York to Paris, I think, and then
Yep.
we got to the moon, in the 60s, and therefore they extrapolated that, Arthur Clarke and Stanley Kubrick extrapolated, 2001 Space Odyssey, and it was just, straightforward extrapolation,
Yeah.
which was kind of logical. But
Yeah.
what we've seen is that even the Concorde failed,
Yep.
and we don't even have, you know, transcontinental travel at the speed of sound. So
Yep.
we're basically still stuck at the speed for the last 50 years. There's been no even linear progression, let alone exponential. And as
Yeah.
far as the space exploration is concerned, we haven't been able to go to the moon with real humans for 50 years almost.
Yep.
So, like, there's an example where
Yeah.
one would have projected exponential growth, and we're failing miserably to live
Yeah.
up to that explanation. And the reasons may be perhaps the laws of the universe, the limits of our meat bags, our
Yep.
human bodies, and the
Yeah.
fact that we're not designed for space. Uh, we're not designed for space, period.
Yeah, no, we evolved here. This is the environment that we do best in. It's very hard to keep a human alive in space. There's a reason why the phenomenal, dramatic, and I would even say epic successes of the space program in the last 50 years have all been uncrewed. They have all been robotic explorations. I
Yeah.
think, and this is me sort of showing my colors as a space nerd. I think that one of the greatest things that, like, the greatest adventures that humanity has ever embarked upon is the Voyager mission. Those two robotic probes. I mean, I'm going to get choked up talking about this. Look at what they did. They went all the way out there. They went to Jupiter, Saturn, both of which had been visited before, I think, but then they went to Uranus, Neptune, neither of which had ever been visited before or since. And yes, only one of them went to Uranus or Neptune, but like, uh, they visited, one of them, the one that went to Neptune, it visited Triton, one of the most, forbidding and alien places in the solar system. It's an incredible journey. And then they kept going. They turned around, they took a final picture of our solar system, and then they kept going, and now they're on their way out. They are past the edge of the solar system by many definitions, and we're still talking to them, and it's just incredible. And yes, they are going to go dark, I think, at some point in the next 10 years. And that's going to be a very sad day. But like, that is incredible. And that is not something that we could do with a human. We would not be able to even keep a human alive out to the orbit of Mars, much less out to Neptune and the heliopause. Are you kidding me? It's
I think it's a
incredible.
perfect place where AI could be also super, super useful.
Oh yeah, yeah. Look, one of the problems with sending rovers to Mars is that speed of light delay. It means that we don't have real time control
Yeah.
over the rover. uh, if we could send a rover, and it wouldn't even need to be a particularly good AI, or at least it would need to be. It would not need to be generalized, right? You don't need AGI to do this. You need something that's really good at a small set of specialized tasks. That does seem like a potentially solvable problem with AI, that you could send a rover that is to some degree autonomous, that can make its own decisions in real time about, okay, that looks pretty interesting and I'm pretty confident that I can get there safely. I'm going to go. And then it just keeps sending data. We're pretty good at keeping rovers alive for a long time on the surface of Mars. But there's limits on what we can do with them because of this. If we could have a rover alive for that period of time on the surface of Mars and have it make some of its own decisions, we'd be able to get a lot more science done with it. That would be amazing. But I will also say that may end up not being possible. It is not clear yet whether AI is going to be able to solve even that very narrow problem, because that seemingly narrow problem has a lot of different, like, big problems built into it. The same way that self-driving cars, we've got AI that gets us, like, solving a large chunk of the problem, but there is still human supervision of all self-driving cars because we have not been able to figure out how to get it to do 100% of it.
So, I mean, if you're correct, and I'm not sure if you're correct about that in the long, long run, but at
Oh
least
yeah,
in the
yeah. I'm not.
short,
I'm not making a claim that that's going to be true in the long, long run.
yeah, in the short to medium run, I think you're reasonably correct. I would venture to make the same bet.
Yeah.
And also, I have ethical problems with cannibalizing resources to send people to Mars while
Oh yeah.
making them sort of entirely dependent. Sort of like
Yes.
people in Silicon Valley hate when other people are dependent on government and stuff like that. But the entire Martian colony would be fully on dependent on resources from Earth for a very, very, very long time. Both
Yes.
people, but also like all kinds of resources, not to mention the energy we need to output to just transport stuff from here
Oh
to
yeah.
there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Uh,
No, it's
so I have
phenomenal.
ethical issues with that whole idea. But let's talk a little bit. So we talked a little bit about the AI issues. We talked a little bit about space. We didn't touch on the empire end of
Yeah.
space, but that kind of goes with the colonization
Yes.
lingo that we touched upon, which is, empire building is a kind of a neo-colonialism.
Yeah.
As a funny fact, by the way, there's an engineer, and I'm forgetting, Chris Whitaker or Chris something. His name was Chris. I interviewed long time ago. Was a good friend of Peter Diamandis, and they were running this uh, crowdsourced fundraising campaign. And they run they run a few $1 million. They managed to raise, and they were supposed to create these satellites. They eventually had to return the money to people and stuff, but they named their satellite, and I forget the name, but the same name that the Empire, uh, the Dark Empire had named their probe that they were sending from the movie The Empire Strikes Back. Remember how The Empire Strikes Back starts in this ice planet where the rebels have a rebel base, and there's
Yep.
these little probes that are
Yep.
looking for the rebels, and
Yep.
one of those probes discovered them and sent the signal for the starship destroyers to come over and stuff like that and attack the rebel base. Well, they named their satellite. I thought that's kind of funny because on the one hand we have this colonial kind of lingo. Other people are even talking about empire building. And
Yep.
then we have people who are choosing the same actual name from the movie The Empire Strikes Back. And not like the good guys, not like the rebels, but like the
Right.
Imperial probe, which I thought it was utterly ironic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the same kind of irony that you see in naming a company Palantir, right? Palantir, the Palantiri are seeing stones from the Lord of the Rings, And so of course, Peter Thiel, famously a huge fan of Lord of the Rings. There's all sorts of companies that he started or is invested in, or they're hoping to attract his investment, that are named after things from Lord of the Rings. But these are seeing stones that let you see and communicate and like learn things about stuff that's happening at a long distance. And so it makes some sense on that level that they would name it Palantir. But also the Palantiri were corrupted by the Dark Lord Sauron, the villain of the Lord of the Rings, uh, and to become a
They
weapon
eventually
that
poison
would
or manipulate the users and lead to their
exactly.
own self-destruction.
Precisely, yes, and to manipulate political leaders on the other side of the battle against Sauron to turn toward him and either collaborate with him explicitly or undermine the efforts to fight him.
And there are many examples of people naming big tech defense contracting companies uh, out of the Lord of the Rings, by the way.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like Anduril, right? Named after the reforged sword. And like, look, I like the Lord of the Rings. I think that there are a lot of great things about that book, but one of the problems I have with it, and it's a problem that modern fantasy authors sort of grapple with in some of their work, is the last book is called The Return of the King, and the happy ending of the Lord of the Rings is that the king is restored to the throne. I don't want the return of the king. I don't want kings. I don't think that having, a hereditary monarch return to a throne and political power is a happy ending.
But the
But
ring was destroyed also, by the way.
yeah, exactly. The ring was destroyed, and so a tyrant was taken out of power. That's great. I love that. Then let's have a democracy,
It's
you know?
shocking to me how some people kind of miss the message. I remember I was interviewing a number of people who were sort of starting up in the tech industry in the sort of to mid 90s to the late 90s, and how the CEOs of major companies who would be hiring them would be like, okay, read this book. It's called Snow Crash. This is the world we're trying to build, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, wait a second. I don't think Neil Stevenson wanted the world of Snow Crash.
No.
I don't think at all he wanted to build that kind of, just like, William Gibson doesn't necessarily want the world of Neuromancer to
No.
be, to our world to become that world, uh, you know. So it's shocking to me how people take that as a roadmap.
Yeah, no, it is really shocking. I mean, like, look, Gibson, and I'm glad you mentioned him. He's one of my favorites. Um,
Mine too.
I was lucky enough to see him speak at a bookstore in Oakland, actually, not long before I started working on my first book, and some of the things that he said about narrative structure were really helpful to me. He he has a book, one of his newer books. I think it's from about 10 years ago, called The Peripheral, and it was turned into, I think, a mini series on Amazon or something like that, which I still haven't seen, but I read the book and I like the book. One of the things that he talks about in that book, he has this idea called the jackpot, and the jackpot is ironically named sort of slow moving apocalypse that basically takes as its premise, okay, all of the problems, the serious threatening problems to civilization in the world today, what if we just didn't do anything about them? What if there's nobody at the wheel and they all just come to pass, and enormous amounts of their civilization are destroyed and lots of people die, but there's no like single event that is a collapse. There's just like a slow destruction of civilization and deaths of lots of people, but there's still sort of lots of people living in the hollowed out wreck who are doing mostly okay. There's just, a lot fewer of them, and things are a lot worse overall. Um, I fear that even though Gibson was extraordinarily explicit that this is not a good thing, that this is the future that not only do, lots of tech people think is coming, but that they're aiming at it. And the one of the quotes that I start my book with, one of the epigraphs, is this internet meme of the torment nexus, right?
Yeah.
Where a science fiction author writes a book called, I created the torment nexus as a cautionary tale. And then the tech billionaire says, at long last, we've created the torment nexus from the classic sci-fi novel, Don't Create the Torment Nexus. Like, don't make the jackpot happen. We should be trying to prevent that. uh the metaverse is not a great thing. Snow Crash is not a great thing. I don't want to live in a cyberpunk dystopia. But Peter Thiel, to rag on him again, said that we should use 1950s and 60s science fiction as a roadmap for what to do in the future, and we should develop the oceans, develop the deserts, develop space. And like, okay, yeah, develops a euphemism there for exploit and destroy, but like, uh, develop the deserts? Does Peter Thiel think that the message of Dune is develop the deserts? Like, does he think that the Harkonnens are the good guys? Like, what exactly is going on here?
By the way, this is a good segue.
Yeah.
But before we get the segue, because we talked about AI and space, but maybe one last question. Okay, so if it's kind of scientifically sort of not not obvious, it's almost kind of obvious that Mars in the near future, maybe in the next 50 years at least, is not happening. That's kind of my
Yeah.
estimate, obviously.
Yeah.
Uh, why Elon and others insist so much on space? I mean, they're not stupid. Are they in merely denial, or what's the issue? What's the appeal for them to go to space so much that they are, I don't know, either in denial or sort of have some kind of an evil plan for it that they don't want to share with us? Why?
Yeah, I think so. A couple of things. They're not stupid, but I do think that a lot of these tech billionaires are out of the habit of thinking, especially like thinking critically about themselves and their own ideas. And like thinking, you can be smart and not sort of use it, right? You can not think. And I think, and we can put aside questions like, okay, what is intelligence? Is it a monolithic thing? I don't think it is. But like, put that aside for a sec. Thinking requires effort, right? Actual thought requires real effort, and it can be very easy to trick yourself into thinking that you're thinking
I think
without actually doing the work.
Richard Feynman said something to the effect that it's very easy to fool people, and you are the easiest people to fool yourself. Something
Absolutely.
to that effect, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that that's right, right? Like, you can get in the habit of just saying stuff that sounds pretty good to you and thinking that that's thought. And if nobody around you pushes back, and if you fool yourself, then you're in trouble. And if you're a billionaire, a lot of the people around you are never going to push back, because you've got the Midas touch, and they're afraid to push back because they work for you and dependent on you for all their money and whatnot. And
I think
so,
we can see that with Trump as a president, but
oh yeah,
Elon is legendary for firing people and people like avoiding him and stuff, and
yep,
him firing them on the spot on a whim for whatever minuscule reason or whatever is happened.
exactly,
So
yeah. Yeah, no, I think the people around Elon don't say no to him, and that's the kiss of death for critical thought. And so, you know, is this like a cynical plan for space? I don't think by and large it is. I mean, there probably some of these, space billionaires probably, but like Musk was interested in space and made that very clear way before he was a billionaire. Bezos talked about going to space in his high school valedictorian speech.
yeah,
I don't think that this is just an evil plan and a cover for something for them. I think they really believe this stuff. And it's easy to keep believing something even if it's not true, if A, it's a dearly held dream of yours that you're not, and B, you're not really in the habit of thinking or critical self-examination anymore. And C, uh, you know, this is also a convenient dream for them. It provides excuses for things that they already want to do. It provides a sense of meaning and purpose and direction for them. And like this all makes it more likely that it's a genuine belief rather than something cynical. And so I think they really, don't see these problems or don't believe them, right? Like there was an incident a few years back. A friend of mine, science journalist, John Wenz, he sort of ended up getting in an indirect fight with Musk where he published something in response to something that Musk said. He went, Musk said something about terraforming Mars by nuking the Martian polar caps, and that would
Right,
thicken the
right, right.
atmosphere, right? And so then John did what a good journalist does. He went and talked with people who are experts on Mars, and they said, yeah, you could probably melt them that way. That wouldn't be enough. That would not be enough to create like a good atmosphere to like start a terraforming process. And Musk actually saw that and responded, publicly saying, "Oh, but that's not true. There's all sorts of CO2 locked up in the rocks on Mars too." And so John went and talked to the experts again. They said, "Yeah, there is some locked up in the rocks. That's not enough either. Still not going to work." And Musk just, he couldn't see it. He's used to not thinking and always being right. I mean, I talk about this in my book. This great moment, which I thought was really revealing, that a different science journalist friend of mine, Shannon Sterone, pointed out in an article that she wrote about Mars, um, where Musk was on a different podcast, the Lex Fridman podcast, talking about Mars, and Fridman had him read the Pale Blue Dot speech
Carl
by Carl
Sagan.
Sagan. Yeah. And where Sagan says in that speech, there is nowhere else, at least in the near term, where we could go to live. Visit, maybe, live, not yet. Earth is where we make our stand, something like that. And this is Carl Sagan, right?
Yeah.
Sagan says something like that, he's probably right. And
That's what
Sagan, by the way,
convinced me. Sagan was one of the people who kind of showed me the limitations of us in space.
yeah, and Sagan was more optimistic about us in space than I am, in part because he was more optimistic about it, and in part because we know more now than
Yeah.
Sagan did, and a lot of what we've learned has made the case look even worse. And I mean, and that's also, to be clear, something I should say about like the 1950s science fiction writers. There's all sorts of stuff about space that they didn't know, and they didn't know how hard it was going to be. But Musk is reading this Pale Blue Dot speech, and he gets to the part where Sagan says there's nowhere else that we can go to live in the near term, and Musk says, "Well, but that's not true. That's false. Mars." And like, buddy, that's Carl Sagan. He knows more about this than you. And
Yeah.
so do the experts that my friend John interviewed. Like, go talk with a real scientist. They will tell you that's not true. But like, and this brings us back to something else that we were talking about earlier. I think that Musk and certainly Andreessen, and many of these other billionaires are dismissive of the idea of scientific expertise. Andreessen is very, very, very clear about this in his Techno-Optimist manifesto, which I completely agree with what you said about it before. It's just fascist. That's a fascist manifesto. He
Okay, before we
says,
move
oh,
there,
yeah.
let's just stop for a second because
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
take kind of an account of where we're at, because I know you have to leave in 22 minutes, so we need
That's
to
true.
stop before that for me to be able to upload the file.
Totally.
So I'm really enjoying this conversation, but we talked about AI, we touched about space. Let's talk a little bit about the crusade to control the fate of humanity. And I
Yeah.
think maybe one of the flagpoles or intended flagpoles as a direction for the fate of humanity could be taken in, and maybe the fate of our entire civilization could be, or at least intentionally by the author, Mark Andreessen's Techno Optimist Manifesto.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
what's wrong with being a techno optimist like Mark Andreessen?
Well, so some of it is what we talked about before, right? That technology just is not the solution to every single problem. And that Techno Optimist Manifesto sort of has as one of its base assumptions that every problem can be solved with technology. And that is not how the world works, like we were saying before. Um, Another problem is, as you were saying before, it's a sort of fascist vision. It's this vision of like total control of humanity by tech oligarchs. That's not a world I want to live in. Um, and another problem
The
is just that
intellectual
it's
lineage from people like Marinetti is shocking to me,
yes,
and
yeah,
and it's not even covert, it's
no,
overt,
it is, yeah,
right? That's
and
what's
like
shocking me, and kind of I think he likes to be up in people's faces, but I mean, with a fascist, really?
I know. I mean, it's really crazy because like he says in the manifesto, "Oh, we're not left wing, we're not right wing. You know, we
Yeah,
have all sorts of political orientations." Here's a quote from the author of the fascist manifesto that I think should
right.
really be a guiding light for us. And here's a list of people who should be, you know, our patron saints of techno optimism. And hey, yeah, there's a bunch of fascists on here. Um, and also some people on that list who I think would look at the or would look at the techno optimist manifesto and say, oh yeah, I disagree with this entire thing. But but like it's really quite shocking how openly fascist that manifesto is. And uh and also one of the sort of moves that manifesto makes that like serves that fascist agenda is this outright explicit rejection of domain level expertise, right? Andreessen says that we the techno optimists are the keepers of the real scientific method, unlike those unaccountable scientists in their ivory towers. And like you know by real scientific method, he seems to mean, oh, yeah, we believe in all sorts of things that we just think are possible because they sound cool to us. And we don't want to listen to the limits that the real experts who've spent their entire
Or
career
because we
studying
make
these
money.
things. Yeah, because we make money. Exactly. Yeah. Uh, and so we're going to believe that, he says in that thing that he thinks the Earth's carrying capacity he thinks the Earth could easily support 80 billion people or more. Uh, and that we can easily go out into space and just, easily generate more energy. Like none of those things are easy. And I don't think that even the most optimistic projections of carrying capacity for Earth go anywhere near 80 billion. I mean, and he also just has like pure denial of very hard, clear statistics. Like he says, the human population of Earth may already be dropping. No, it's not. That's just something you can just look up. That is not true. The human population of Earth is still growing. Like that is just a mistake, and it's somewhat alarming to see him be like, oh yeah, that might be true. And like, no, buddy, it's not. You can just look that up. But he doesn't believe in expertise. He doesn't believe in clear hard facts from expert sources, and instead he dismisses academics and scientists as unaccountable, powerful people experimenting with society and insulated in their ivory towers. Like, okay, Mark, who is unaccountable and experimenting with humanity and insulated from the consequences of his actions? I don't think that's the academics, buddy. I think maybe that's you. But yeah, it's really and also a phenomenally whiny piece of work. He says that
Kind of
technologists.
resentful, I think.
Yeah, resentful is exactly right. Yeah, he says we
It's
don't
kind of
get.
like, get out of my way and let me do my startup techno capitalist, you know, prodigal tech bro kind of thing that I've been
It,
doing,
yeah.
and let me make my billions into trillions.
Yep. And I think that not only is that very clearly the attitude of the thing, but it means that the funniest line, to me at least, in that entire manifesto is when he says, we believe in an absolute rejection of resentment. I'm like, buddy, this manifesto is the politics of resentment. Like, what are you doing? Go to therapy, man.
And your line from the book about this that I loved, and you were borrowing somebody else, and I forget her name, but you're saying somewhere that the thing about Goliaths is that they always want to be Davids.
Yeah, that's a John Boyce line. Yeah. No, I love that line, and I was so happy that I was able to include it because that's exactly it. Andreessen's one of the most powerful people alive, right? He is
Together with
the
Musk, Bezos, uh,
absolutely.
Peter Thiel, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, Andreessen's the head of the biggest tech venture capital firm. He and like, he talks, people listen. He's got enormous amounts of money, billions and billions. We don't even know exactly how much money he has. He might not even know exactly how much money he has. The investments that his firm Andreessen Horowitz have made have touched the lives of every single human alive, for better or for worse. They've changed things. And and he thinks, he sets himself out in that manifesto as the plucky underdog. He's
Yeah.
part of the establishment. If anyone is, it's him. But every Goliath wants to be David.
That reminded me to Douglas Rushkoff's Survival of the Richest,
Yeah.
about how he was hired to tell these people how to survive the apocalypse. And
Yeah.
they were like the richest, a bunch of billionaires trying to figure out, okay, how do we survive in our bunkers after the end of the world and the collapse of civilization? And he's like, guys, shouldn't be thinking with all your money and power how to prevent that.
Yep.
So like you feel like the most disempowered, pessimistic people, and you're supposed to be exactly the opposite, right?
Yeah. No,
Anyway,
it's oh, sorry.
Adam, time
One
is advancing here very much.
yes.
So where would we go from here? So we have maybe 5 or 6 minutes, give or
Yeah.
take. uh, we never had the chance to talk about the political influence that those people are able to exert, not only
Yeah.
in American politics, but shockingly to me, one of the most revelatory part was about their political influence in places like the United Kingdom,
Yep.
for example. And here we have to talk about the Oxford Martin School of Future Studies, which is now, I think, renamed. I had
Yeah.
James Martin actually back in the day on the podcast before he
Oh,
passed away. I was lucky enough to have him. And he donated something like $200 million to them, or maybe 250, like
I
hundreds of
think that's right.
millions.
Yeah, it's a lot of money.
Uh, so should we mention, and those are very influential people, like the effective altruism community, Nick Bostrom specifically,
Yeah.
uh, Eliezer Yudkowsky. Those are all intellectually hugely influential people in the
Yeah.
singularitarian, transhumanist, extropian, effective altruism community.
Yeah.
How can we touch on them for a couple of minutes? That's maybe impossible.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. Well, I might have to come back, but and I'd be happy to, by the way. But yeah, I think. Look, uh, in the UK, yeah. I mean, first of all, you've got these set of professors at Oxford who are advising Parliament on AI stuff, and these are the same people claiming that the existential risk from super intelligent AGI, something that is ill-defined, that nobody knows how to build. Uh, Toby Ord, the leader, one of the leaders of the effective altruist community, and one of these Oxford professors who's advising Parliament, he has said that the risk from that kind of machine to humanity over the next century, I think, um, is 50 times greater than the risk from climate change and nuclear war combined. And I think that that's like almost criminally irresponsible claim to make. Um, and it's terrifying to have somebody who believes that advising Parliament. But and there was also not in the
That kind
current.
of fuzzy math really annoys me.
Yeah.
And because I've actually had a number of those people on my podcast. Like I've had Anders Sandberg twice, I've had Stuart Armstrong, I've had a few of
Yep.
them. But I also had Emil Torres, and we
Yeah.
actually went through Nick Bostrom's astronomical weight paper and the
Oh yeah.
ridiculous math that he employs there. And
Yeah.
that
I
was
know
kind
that
of an
paper.
eye-opening conversation for many people, I hope. So
Yeah.
perhaps we should just recommend people go check that conversation and references there has enough to cover on the Nick Bostrom and his colleagues.
Yeah, and also, I'm gonna plug my book. I talk about this at great length in my book, More Everything Forever. So
Absolutely. Your book is, as I said, the best of its kind. And even you can still be a singularitarian and a transhumanist and effective altruist, I believe, in some way, if you take a constructive criticism approach to your book and try to remedy or learn the flaws it exposes in the community,
yep,
and kind of learn and I mean, in some cases build a fresh intellectual ideas and recognize the faults or the dangers where they may be, and you point many of them extremely well.
thank
So
you.
I actually highly recommend your book to everyone, whether they're part of the community or not. It doesn't matter. Everyone should educate themselves because we're talking about AI, space, and the fate of humanity. I mean, who wouldn't want to be interested in that? I presume everyone
Thanks.
would. So, Adam, we've talked now for over 2 hours.
Yeah.
First of all, last two questions that I always ask.
Yep.
First, where can people find more about you and your work?
Well, I have a website, freelanceastrophysicist.com. And I'm also on Blue Sky. It's the main social media that I use these days because I'm sorry,
Right.
there are just too many Nazis on Twitter. But yeah. And I'm hoping to have more places where people can follow my work soon, but for now, that's what I've got. I mean, I'm a freelance journalist, so I also publish, articles all over the place. But if you want to know about the new articles that are being published, like in places like Fortune or The Guardian or whatever, or Scientific American, then yeah, follow me on Blue Sky is the best way to do that for now.
Adam, what's the best way to wrap up our conversation? What's perhaps the single most important message that you'd like to send us away with?
That's a great question. I think the main, most important thing that I want to send listeners away with is that just as, you know, Kurzweil and the effective altruists and all of these other groups and people and Musk and whatnot, they all have these ideas about the future. And one of the things that they all have in common is they claim that these ideas are inevitable. Kurzweil in particular does this, right? But this is something that all of them do to one extent or another. And what I want to emphasize is that that's not true. There is no inevitable vision of the future. The future is always something that we can shape and shift. The only thing inevitable, like I was saying before, is the increase of entropy, but there are so many different ways that can happen, and so many different things that can happen between now and the end of the universe, many, 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 many trillions upon trillions of years from now. I think that we have to keep in mind that that we have choices, that the future development of all of those human factors, politics, sociology, and also technology, the future direction of technology, all of these things are open to human choice and deliberation. And we can make a different future.
We have choices, and the future is not inevitable. That's
Yeah.
a message I can get behind because that's kind of the message I've been trying to push for the last 10 years. And the original thing which pushed me away from the singularity community over a decade ago, that kind of teleological inevitability, which
Yep.
should mean that we can like eat pizza and drink beer and watch Netflix until the end of the world. And I think that's not the attitude I want to embrace or I want to recommend others to embrace because nothing is inevitable. I agree with you 100%. We have choices. And Adam Becker, I want to thank you so much for your book and for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Nicola. This was great conversation.
Thank you.